Good afternoon and welcome to Talk on Race. We are so happy to be here today. And as always, we start with our land acknowledgement. The Lower Cape Fear YWCA serves the people located within the Lower Cape Fear region. This land once thrived with life from indigenous peoples, known today as the Cape Fear Indians and the Waccamaw Siouan Indian people, living in established settlements along the Cape Fear River and Lake Waccamaw, along with many other established sites in the region. We need to protect and honor the history of these places. Indigenous people are not relics of the past. They are still here, continuing to demonstrate their talents and gifts amidst a backdrop of ongoing colonialism and oppression. They are worth celebrating. We hope our land acknowledgement statement will inspire others to stand with us in solidarity with Native nations. Again, thank you for joining Talk on Race. And we would like to make our announcement that the YWCA is hosting its 36th annual Women of Achievement Awards this Thursday, March 3rd at 7 p.m. It's open to the public. All you have to do is tune in to womenofachievement.swell.gives to watch the awards live from the comfort of your home. Join us in celebrating the outstanding accomplishments of women and young leaders who work daily to create positive change in our community. We are so excited to have this conversation today about transracial adoption and fostering. I have two phenomenal panelists with me, Kabrina and Gina, who are going to share with us their knowledge, their experience, their expertise in this conversation. And I just ask that everyone who's listening remain open, remain honest to the dialogue that will take place today. We are not here to tell you what to do. We are simply having a conversation that so many people kind of have quietly or in their homes or with their close friends and with their families. Transracial or interracial adoption is something that everybody talks about. I remember being with my son and we were shopping and, I'm like looking at all of these people and I'm like, what's everybody breaking their neck to look at? And they're looking at a family. It was a white family with a black child and everybody's just looking and staring. And so, me being curious, I'm looking too, like, what's happening over there? And literally the lady was just shopping for groceries with her child. But, the biases in our country, the biases that people just have in general, racism does exist, prejudices and discrimination does exist, but there are so many children in our country, around the world, who need safe, loving, supportive homes. And so it's something that I felt and that our committee felt with advocacy and racial justice, that it would be a really good conversation to bring to the table and to bring to the forefront with people who have experience in placement, friends, family, and their jobs and their friendship life, anywhere, to have the conversation today. And so this is where we find ourselves with Kabrina and with Gina. So if you would introduce yourselves to our audience, that would be great. We can start with Gina. Go ahead, and Gina, we'll start with you.
Hi, I'm Gina Thimble. I work for an organization called Be the Bridge, and we are a racial literacy organization. Our goal is to equip people and communities to not only be aware of racial injustice, but to respond to racial brokenness in healthy ways. Part of our journey has been realizing that white adoptive parents, in particular to children of color, really needed some more guidance and information about the special considerations that go along with adopting children of color into white communities. And so our founder, Latasha Morrison, was really adamant and passionate that we kind of create this catalog of information, which is now what's called our Transracial Adoption Guide. But that is the work that I do, that and whiteness training with Be the Bridge.
Hello, everyone. My name is Kabrina Red. I am a foster parent through Easter Seals UCP here in Wilmington. The mission for Easter Seals is to provide meaningful and exceptional services so that children, adults, and families living with disabilities, behavioral health challenges, and autism can live, learn, work, and play in their communities.
And thank you so much, both of you, for being here today. And your work, is definitely vital to our community in creating more equitable, safe spaces for people in general. And so, what ways have you seen, or what circumstances have you seen as to why maybe families seek adoption or seek placement? I can make assumptions all day, but I know both of you seen it. So, Cabrina, have you seen it? Where maybe families place children up for adoptions because they have special needs, or because, mom is young. What ways and how have you seen adoption become a part of the conversation with families?
Right, that's a great question. So I am somewhat fairly new to the fostering world. I've been fostering about a year and a half, so I see more of the fostering side of things. But as far as what I've seen with adoption, I've seen kids come from all different backgrounds, all different races, and at that point, it's if they are adoptable, or if you're just going to foster, if you're focusing on reunification. There's been a ton of different things. I couldn't even narrow it down if I tried as to the reasons why, but I can say that I've come across some really great kids, with and without disabilities that are in the system in the Tri-County area.
Yeah, yeah. And what made you decide to foster?
Whew, man. So I am a social worker, and as a social worker, we tend to wear a ton of different hats.
Yeah,
And when I was younger, I always saw like all these different kids, different families look different ways. I was like, dang, this is so cool. Like, I wonder what this is like. And once I hit my 20s, I started doing some research when I was in college on fostering, adopting, just kind of trying to educate myself on what those processes look like, what they look like from state to state, county to county, different things like that. But I always wanted to foster, just because I feel like it bridges the gap between all the key players, all the stakeholders, and the bio families, and letting them have like a neutral person that interacts with both sides directly, so it doesn't always feel so like us against them or them against the world. I've
yeah,
wanted to fill that space as a neutral party for them to be able to connect with, get resources from, be a support for them. And once I hit 21 and I settled down after college, I was like, all right, I hit the ground running, wanted to get this done. Next thing I knew, pandemic hit, everything shifted. And I was just like, oh God, how am I going to get this done? And, people adapted, people evolved, and we were able to get all our trainings done, things of that nature. And now I'm a foster parent.
Wow. 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 Thank you for sharing. And
Yes.
Gina, when shifting a little bit, when people come to buy the book, when they seek your services for resources, what are some of the circumstances with how they found, like, oh, we know we need your help? How does that conversation typically happen?
Well, I would also like to mention, I forgot to mention this in my introduction, but I'm an adoptive parent myself. So a transracial adoptive parent. I have 4 kids, 2 biological, 2 kids who were adopted. And I think many people come to adoption for a lot of different reasons, but it
Yeah.
seems to boil down to, I see a lot of couples who have struggled with infertility, or just couples who have kind of a humanitarian desire to do something to help better our world. And so they go to the adoption foster care system. But yeah, I mean, I know personally when I began this process, I was very, very naive. And I'm speaking as someone who had a master's degree in social work at that point. I mean, I was aware of systemic racism, but I did not connect that at all to the foster care system in particular and the child protective system. And so, unfortunately, it takes a lot more than love to build a family. Love may be one of the very first steps you need, but I would say it's a baby step on the journey. I think we really want to get to a place as parents, as professionals, where we're caring for the needs of the whole child. So we're not just providing food or shelter, but we're really looking at what does this child need to grow up having a healthy view of themselves, having a healthy racial ethnic identity. And I think for white parents, that's very difficult for us to do because a lot of parents, white people, have not thought about race in the ways that people of color have. And so, and many white parents are, I know that I was naive to the fact that many communities of color even consider the child protective system and foster care system as a continuation of a long history of state interference and a punitive system that really ends up punishing communities of color. So it's a very complex and layered conversation, but normally when families come to us, they come to us because they've realized they need help.
Yeah, yeah. And again, thank you so much for sharing and being vulnerable with us. When I was kind of preparing for today, I came across the Institute for Family Studies. And the one thing that I think kind of knocked me off my shoes a little bit, but didn't surprise me, but knocked me off my shoes still, was that like in 2011, I guess, a lot of studies have gaps now because of like the pandemic, because, they do the 10-year study. So this study it's been a while, but 77% of adoptive mothers of kindergartners were white, like 77%. And so when I continue to read the study and look into the study, I just, I was like, oh wow, like this is more than 50%. This is more than 65. I mean, 77% is a huge chunk of who is adopting children, Black or white, in the system. And then when I looked at the demographics of children being adopted, and again, this study is focusing on kindergartners. So when they're around the age of 5, entering into kindergarten, 39% of the children are white, 23% of the children are Hispanic, 17% are Asian, 11% are multiracial, and only 9% of the children are Black. And so, like when you look at those numbers, like still 77% of those of the parents of these children are white women. And I do think that I'm so glad, and I think that's one of the reasons why I reached out to you, was because white parents are gonna need resources. They're gonna, whether the kids are Black or Asian or Latinx, they're gonna need to understand cultural differences. They're gonna need to understand, like, where do we go to church at? Do we put ourselves in a church that is culturally relevant to one child, two of the kids, all of us? Do we go to a multi-ethnic, multi-racial church? Or, what type of schools do we put them in? Do we do private schools? I think, so when I was looking at your organization, I was really happy to see that, because there's a whole like trend on TikTok about interracial adoptees. And there were a couple of Black women on there saying like they grew up in homes and they were raised by white people and they didn't even realize they were Black. Right. It's so like the need for cultural competency. I think we know after the racial unrest summer of 2020, I think everybody said, oh, okay, there's some cultural competency that needs to take place everywhere. But I think it's super great and important that cultural competency also takes place in adoption and in fostering. So Cabrina, did you get any type of cultural competency training as you were being licensed to be a foster mom?
Yes.
You
Yes,
did?
I
Okay,
did.
please tell us about it.
Yes, we did an extensive amount of training. I felt like I was in training for like ever. And I was really excited when I saw there was a piece on cultural competence on different, ethnicities, race. I was really excited. And some of the pieces that we discussed were just like, children and what their needs may be and how it can be different depending on their culture. And so we have to actually agree to, like, if we get a child, and they, are a part of a certain religion, like, are you comfortable, like, taking them to this church? Are you comfortable taking them to a mosque? Are you comfortable,
Yeah.
letting them go with a friend? Like, all of those things are on the forefront. And, even down to things that we don't think about often, of like hair care. Like, do we need to have training
Oh,
on,
hair care
ethnic
is important.
hairstyles,
Mhm.
just hair products, different things like that. So I was really excited to see that they captured that in our training process as well.
Yeah, yeah. And Gina, how do y'all go about teaching cultural competency? And I want to show your guide. So while you're talking, can you tell me the name of the book again so that I can put it up on the screen?
Sure. It's actually a digital document. So if you go to
Oh, okay.
bethebridge.com slash, I think it's shop, so /shop, then you can go to our guides, and we have several different guides, but one of them is a guide for cross-race parenting. And I love to hear Cabrina and her experience that she did receive some cultural competency training. I know that when we were going through the adoption process for the first time with our agency, this was back in 2010, I guess, we had no training around race other than a couple of books that we could choose to read, but it was still very basic, and it was written by white people. So I think one of the fatal flaws that's lacking right now is that we have not listened or centered the marginalized voices in this space. We have not centered the voices of adult transracial adoptees. Transracial adoption was actually not very popular with white people until after the civil rights movement. So we are really pretty early on in terms of our journey here. And so now you do have transracial adoptees who were raised in white homes and white communities who are speaking out about some of the damages and the harm that was caused to them because we weren't thinking through some of these issues. And I think that as practitioners, as foster parents, as adoptive parents, as community organizations, we do need to really begin to take a high level view of what these systems are. The way Latasha has described it, I'm just going to give you a little analogy that she shared with me, and it's a very old adage, but when you think about let's picture a river and you think about babies kind of floating down this river. When you see them, your first thought is, well, of course, I want to go in. Why is this baby drowning? Why is this baby alone floating down the river? And you go in and you want to grab the babies, right? But ultimately, we have to go upstream. We have to ask the question, why are so many babies floating down the river in the first place? And so the way that we approach adoption, transracial adoption, is very like individual, transactional, just a narrow lens. And I think we really need to open up our view to a wider socio-political lens, and also open up our view to a wider lens of how we care for these children.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you said upstream, it also reminded me, Dan Heath wrote a book called Upstream. And that is literally the premise of his book. We use it a lot in like resilience, Prevent Child Abuse America uses it, Circle of Parents uses it, which is a model for like a support group for parents. And it says the same thing that, a lot of times our services deal with the downstream issues, the things that we see, right? But
Mm-hmm.
in our actuality, if we're drinking downstream, the poison is coming from upstream. And so our policies, what we need to focus on is the upstream problem to reduce the trickle down effect. And so, yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I'm very much aware that, Gina, that, a lot of people did not get cultural competencies training, right? And so, and then there's people who, right after the civil rights movement, have unfortunately subscribed to the colorblind racism and the aversive racism, right? Which is, oh, I don't see color as a way to try to say like I'm not racist, or I don't see racism, which is actually what has it turned into be harmful for Black and brown people, right? And so it's not surprising that, if you don't do cultural competency, if you have people right after the 60s who start doing transracial adoptions, and through the 70s, and, like we're supposed to love all, but we aren't embracing the individuality that comes with people, that, sometimes you get these TikTok flows of like, my transracial adoption experience was horrible.
Yes. Yes.
But it doesn't have to be. And so I'm really glad that organizations and churches and families and individuals who've been through experiences are stepping up to the plate to demand, like, this is a great thing. Adoption is a great thing. Providing a safe home for children who don't have a home is a good thing. But even though it's a good thing, we got to go deeper, and we got to put some accountability systems in place to ensure that that these children are embraced, and not even just are embraced, that they're able to embrace themselves, how they come to the table, you know. So, can we talk about some maybe misconceptions that happen in adoption and in fostering? Maybe some misconceptions that maybe you had or you've heard other people have. Anybody can answer that.
Kabrina?
Oh
Sabrina's
gosh.
like,
Okay.
I'm not answering
Okay.
that.
Okay. I think that I'm gonna answer the question, I promise. I think that there are a lot of misconceptions and preconceived notions surrounding adoption, foster care, guardianship, kinship care, all the things. And it really took a lot for me to reframe my thinking around it, because where I was at that point was like, hey, I'm a foster parent, I'm about to be saving the world one kid at a time, all these great things. Like I just thought foster care was like the bomb.com. I could not wait to like get my first placement, and like, all that excitement. And through the process, I really like slowly but surely started to see some things. And I remember like one of my placements, they had visitation with bio parents weekly. And the bio parents would text me and be like, oh my goodness, like he smells great. Like he's so clean. And I'm like, is he not supposed to be clean and smell good? Like, what is this about? And, once I got to know them, they had other experiences through their friends, family, and such, where foster care was not the greatest experience for them. And, they were concerned about, is my kid going to get this? Is my kid going to get that? And having to be forced to be on the outside of things and not really have that control piece, it really makes a lot of bio parents struggle, which is why I said at the beginning, my main goal in being in this role is to serve as a resource and a support for the bio parents. Like, if we're working towards reunification, that's cool. Like, what do you need? Like, what's going to make you feel more comfortable? And like I said, being in the times of pandemic, we couldn't always do face-to-face, visitation. So like, are we doing video calls? Are we like, what do we need to kind of help bridge that gap between like, your kid being with you and your kid being with me? And how do we make those two things come together for the child to have success?
Yeah, and it's so cool to hear you say that, because and I do watch TV, so I hate to bring up lots of media, right? But like on the media, they make it seem as if, foster parents don't want bio parents involved. Like,
Right.
they, reunification is great, but it's not something necessarily that, lots of foster parents are seeking. And so it's really affirming and inspirational to hear you say, like, I'm here for bio parents because I want reunification to happen. And I want it to happen where bio parents get all the resources and support that they need, because you're right. I mean, we've all heard the horror stories about foster care. But like it's really great to just to hear as a foster mom, you like, no, I'm here to support them and give them what they need. That is super cool, super cool.
Oh
And
yeah.
Gina, what are some misconceptions maybe that you had about adoption and you before you became adopted mom and then you were like, oh wow.
Oh goodness. Honestly, I had probably had a lot of misconceptions. But I think a huge misconception in this conversation around adoption is that so often we believe, and I think the media does feed into this, or news articles that, only have a certain amount of words to tell a very big story on a very, a few paragraphs. But that is a child who finds their quote unquote forever family. I'm not a big fan of that term, but that does not mean that the child has not experienced trauma. And I'm talking about even kids who were adopted as infants, because just the very act of separating a newborn from its mother is a traumatic act that is going to have implications on that child for the rest of their lives. And so I also think another misconception is that in the foster care system, and I think Cabrina is, I don't want to say she's a unicorn, but I think she sounds like an amazing foster parent.
Right,
And
right,
I'm sure
exactly.
I'm sure that there are others out there. But in the foster care system, I think a lot of people who come into it, they just assume and believe that those families that the children have been separated from are deficient in some way, right? And I think this is really where we have to ask those harder, more high level questions. Why is there overrepresentation for Black children in the foster care system? Why are American Indian, Alaska Native, Indigenous children overrepresented? Why are Latinx children overrepresented in 20 states? I mean, that's some pretty recent research. And it goes back, I believe, to our individual lens of, I'll just share this, if I can share another little allegory, kind
Yeah,
of like my,
yeah.
and I learned this from the Racial Equity Institute, whom, I highly recommend if you can do any
Yes.
training through
I love
REI.
them. I took
Yeah.
that. Yes, I took their
Okay.
groundwater training.
Yes, I loved
Yeah,
it.
excellent. It's
But
excellent.
they talk about this story. So imagine yourself walking up to a pond and you spot a dead fish, and you're going to be asking yourself, what's wrong with this fish? Why is this fish sick? Was this fish abused? Does the fish's mom need to go to a treatment center or get some sort of, mental health care or
Yeah.
substance abuse care? But if you walk up to a pond and you see 300 dead fish, you're going to be asking a different question. And that's what is in the pond that's killing all of these fish. And so I think that is just a good way of saying, like, we really need to be interrogating why there's overrepresentation. Studies that have been conducted up to this point are kind of getting conflicting answers to that, but it's probably a very big pot with a mix of different answers, from implicit biases to
Yeah.
communities of color being living in a world where, I mean, the CDC and I know the American Academy of Pediatrics and physicians, they have declared racism a public health crisis, right? And so we have families who are operating in our world who are feeling the weight of racism, who are feeling the weight of generational trauma. And so I think we can look there for some of the answers too about why some groups are overrepresented. But I guess I love Cabrina's heart and her desire to really work with first families, because that's kind of a pet peeve of mine too. And it's something that I've learned through listening to adult adoptees. But so often we see adoption as ownership, right? Especially white people. Like, let's face it, we have
Yeah.
a long history of colonization and conquest, and um, and I don't feel like we should look at adoption that way, like. And I love that one of my daughters gets to see her first mom several times a year at least. They get to talk on the phone. She gets to come to birthday parties. She's been, with their family at Christmas. And so I can do that because I don't believe that my daughter is mine alone. I believe that, and her mother doesn't either, Shanita. I think she would say the same thing. Like, we didn't know what we were doing 10 years ago, but we've been able to just be together, learn from each other, grow together, and heal together, because Shanita had been through a trauma. And so anyway, I went a little bit on a rabbit hole there.
No, no, no.
This is
Honestly, as you
great.
were, yeah, it is great. And I think I mean, the idea of that we can't look at adoption as ownership, I think is huge, because so many people think of it like, no, this child is mine. And like, I'm not sharing. And I think sometimes that's the same type of feeling that you get in fostering, right? This child is mine. I'm not sharing. Bio parent is going to come in and we're going to have to regulate all over again. But I think we can't look at children as property. And that is something that the U.S. is, I mean, struggling with right now with the border crisis, right? We can't look at children as property, as possessions. We have to look at them as these are little people, and little people who have feelings, who have thoughts, who deserve to be loved, who deserve to be supported, who also need structure, right? Because we just can't say, do whatever you want to do as a little person. You got to go to bed on time, right? but overall, like, they do have to be treated and looked at as a being. And I think about my time. I wasn't a foster mom, but I worked in a foster home. And we had kids all different ages, babies. We had Black, white, Latinx, biracial. Some kids, we didn't even know their racial makeup because it was all up in the air. But we treated each other as family, and I think about that experience often, because now that they're older, and even though I'm not there anymore, we're all Facebook friends. So I get to see, who they've grown up to be and their children. And sometimes they still hit me up for $10. But I love it because when we think about community resilience, they say they need children after they've experienced trauma in childhood. They just need one consistent adult that they can rely on, that is supportive, that they can count on. And that is how you begin to develop resilience. And so I think both of you are doing it in two different capacities. But I think they are both done in a beautiful way. What would you want the community to know when you are out and about and when you are just going on in your daily life? Gina, do you get questions? Cabrina, do you get questions like, where's that child's mama? Or, when you've had to pick up child from daycare, what has some of that experience kind of been like?
I'll let Gina take the lead on that one.
Well, Janiqua, you started by talking about, a family in a grocery store who is getting a lot of stares. And the reality is that my family does too, right? Because there's 4 white people in my family and 2 children of color. And whenever we go out to eat, if we go to church, I didn't notice it very much, but one of my boys did. He's like, why is everybody looking at us? And we have definitely gotten a lot of comments that I think I used to have a lot more tolerance for well-meaning comments, but the truth is that my child's story is my child's story, and no one is entitled to know my child's story. No one is entitled to understand, how this came to be. That's something that she's going to decide, with whom and when to share. The challenge with transracial adoption, of course, is that you can't hide, through your race. Like, if you're a white child being adopted into a white family, you may not ever have to tell anybody you're adopted if you don't want to. But with transracial adoption, that's taken away from those children. And so if you're someone who's curious about a family, I would just caution you to maybe step back a little bit, to maybe prioritize the child's comfort over your own, and just understanding that you don't need to know what's happening, right?
Yeah.
But I would love to hear you, Cabrina, as well, talk about comments.
I've had similar experiences, just with the majority of my placements being white. I'm obviously Black. The stares, the comments, and just the uncertainty. So I've run into a lot of people where, we may have shared the same space, shared a few rooms a couple times, and they're like, I wanted to ask, or I just didn't know how, or I didn't, know what the comfort level was. And my biggest advice to people is to like just stay in your lane. Like it comes down to that for me. I had, people, because we were out and about, and in my eyes, we were a regular family just like anybody else. And when we would be out like at a restaurant, and he would like be in my face and playing in my hair, and they're like, oh my God, he loves you so much. And I'm like, yeah. Like
he's supposed to.
right. And so, and again, that just goes back to the pieces of like having to reframe my own thinking, and just know that there are a lot of people that aren't educated on what this looks like, what it could look like, all the amazing things that come out of fostering, adopting, all those different pieces. And I think it's just a lot of just discomfort and uncertainty on what you can and can't say, or what you should or shouldn't do. And I'm hoping that a lot of those folks are looking at this so they can have some background and some, some basis, some foundation as they're moving forward in their lives.
Yeah, and to know, like, when you see people that may not look like you may be curious, but your curiosity should lead you to research.
Yes.
Not to
Yes.
have a conversation with me about my experience, or to try to be nosy about how we came to be in this family unit. And I think it reminds me a lot of our previous talk on race. We talked about interracial dating and marriage. And, one of the women on the panel, she said she had someone walk up to her and say, "You are the hope of the future." And she just was like, how am I the hope of the future? Because this is my husband. Like, one, that is too much pressure. Okay. And number two, like, what gave you permission to say that to me? And why do I look like it is okay for you to speak to me in this manner when we don't even know each other? Like, I'm sitting here trying to eat my steak, and you're telling me I'm the hope of the future.
Can I just say something about that? That is so funny. And I think like Cabrina's story too, she is defying racial scripts, right? Like we kind of think that, we're always absorbing messages about race. We're always being socialized about race, whether we know it or not. So when they see a Black woman with a white young child, that is like a flip of that racial script. So their curiosity is going to be piqued, and then they feel entitled to come to know what's up with that. And there was one other point I was going to, oh yes, about the interracial marriage. You're the hope of the world. And I think like as adoptive parents or foster parents, we constantly get messages that we're such good, selfless people. We're such a great people doing great things. And I think like, I know that they're trying to give encouragement too, but it really sets adopted parents up to be something that they were never intended to be, right? And so we need to be aware of that. And beyond that, like just the, oh, you're going to be the savior of the world, or however they said, it's through like the individual lens, right? Because one relationship, interracial relationship, or one example of a Black woman adopting a white child or vice versa is not going to problematize and change systems. Ibram Kendi says that we are trained to see the problems of individuals, but we're not trained to problematize systems. And I think that's just so true, because individuals are in our face, right? We see their problems, we see our own problems, we see our own brokenness, and we see others' brokenness as well. But the system is really obscure. It's kind of, abstract. It's just not as easy to see and problematize. And so my hope is that we are a generation that is really going to call practitioners and systems to a higher account for the ways that they have caused harm, particularly to communities of color.
Well said. Well, well said. Well said. And when you and this is for you, Gina, when you welcome additional children into your family, did you have conversations with, did you and your husband say, we may get some looks and we may get some stares? Did you have discussions about how are we gonna, build our children back up who are children of color? How are we going to support them through this? Because I think as parents in general, foster parents, adoptive parents, biological parents, you always want to shield your children from the world, right? And not even just from the world. You want to shield them from like the nastiness and the ugliness of the world. And so we do our best to put support mechanisms and to put, barriers in place. But did you have that conversation about like, how am I going to handle this? Or even in your cultural competency, did they give you any tools, Kabrina, about like, if you're out and about and you are approached, this is the best way to handle, someone who maybe means well, but is, is doing harm?
So for me, no, sadly, I had not asked those
Okay.
questions. And I think that's part of why I've become so passionate about this issue is because I thought that I knew and I had no idea. And I'm like, 10, 11 years into this, and I still learn something new every single day. But I think that's really the failure of the system, right? Because
Absolutely.
we are placing children who do have special needs, who do have special considerations, who do deserve to grow up in a home where they see themselves represented, in communities where they see themselves represented. But we're not adequately preparing our families for that. And so, no, I wasn't prepared, but I think like the best advice that I was ever given is to listen to the voices of adult transracial adoptees. And that's really what I've tried to do. Just go to school in, those TikTok videos you mentioned earlier, watching the TikToks, the Instagrams, if they're speaking, I want to listen. If they've written something about it, I want to read it, because it's very similar with racism, right? Like you, Janiqua, and Kabrina, you guys have the lived experience. So you know things that I don't know. I have blind spots that you don't. And so it's the same concept. You're just transferring that over into a different system.
Yeah, absolutely. And Kabrina, because I believe, Kabrina, you live here in Wilmington, right?
Yes, I
And
do.
so, Wilmington is, our population is majority white. I think it's like
Yes.
70%. So I can only imagine kind of what you got, because I mean, when we moved here, my son had a huge afro, like a beautiful black boy joy curly afro. And people would just tap his head all the time. Like they would come and pet his head. And then they were like, oh my God, it's so soft. And I'm like, why are you touching my child? Like, like he's not an experiment. He's not a puppy. We don't touch his child. And I'm clearly a Black woman. And my son, even though he's fair skinned, he's clearly a Black child. And so, like, I had to built myself up to be bold enough to say, please don't touch my son's hair, right? Because at first I was just so shocked. But after it happened like 3 times, I was like, I got to put a boldness in my voice. Do not touch my son's head. So, if I'm experiencing that on my end, what things do you say? How does your support system kind of rally around you, especially as you are flipping the script a lot of times as a Black woman being a foster mom?
Whew, that is a loaded question. I have a ton of answers for you. I will say like my support system consists of mainly, my family, my CPC through Easter seals. Like I lean on them heavily as these things come up because I'm a pretty quiet person. I don't really say a lot and it kind of takes a lot for me to say something, but like things like that I think would just again put me in one of those places where I have to like reframe my thinking of like, okay, what makes this person think that this is okay? And if they're comfortable enough to do it with me and I'm a stranger, what are they doing with other people? And I always try to bring my mind back to that and I always try to look at the bigger picture because those are people touching my hair and stuff like that. I mean, we've experienced that. It's just a thing. And you have to just stop people dead in their tracks of like, no, like this is not okay. Like, I personally never went around touching other people's hair. Like, I don't want anybody touching my hair. Like, it's hair. Like, it's okay. And, just things like that are, I just feel like I always have to be mindful. I have to be mindful of, what I do, what I say, how I do it, how I say it. And especially, when I have my different foster kids with me, just being mindful of all the different things, all the nuances that are going on around me.
Yeah. Yeah. And Gina, bringing it back to you, how do we begin to push against the system? How do we begin to fight against the system? Here at the YWCA, one way that we choose to fight against the system is through our Advocacy and Racial Justice Committee. If you are watching and you want to join ARJ, you're welcome. Just log on to the YWCA lowercasefields.org's website and you can sign up. But we use our Advocacy and Racial Justice Committee. We do trainings on diversity, equity, and inclusion. But thinking about this this conversation around fostering and adoption, how do we begin to fight the systems that are so heavily in place? What what do we do? What's our next step?
That's another $1 million question. It's difficult, and it is one that figuring out, obviously I've been a participant in the system as the way it stands now. And so I've been trying to figure out for the last 10, 11 years, how can I participate in the system, but also resist the system at the same time? And I don't have a great answer for that, except that I believe it's going to take a total reimagining of where we are now. And it's going to take a serious centering of those marginalized voices that are within the system. I know that this report that I looked at recently from childwelfare.gov, one of their action items was to develop research that was centering those marginalized voices, because that is an area that is a huge gap in our research. We have not been doing that. And so, and centering research on those first families in particular who are coming into those, some people call them system of regulation. Unfortunately, communities of color are often over policed and underprotected, or in the foster care system, over regulated and underprotected. And so trying to identify some of those ways that we can completely rethink and be more creative. But I do believe that the overwhelming part of it is that as long as racism continues to be a public health crisis, we're going to continue feeding families into the foster system. And so I think we're at a point in our history where we are reckoning with their problematic history. And so I think we're a generation, hopefully, who's rising up to have these brave conversations and to figure out what is the better way. I don't have all those answers, but there are people who are working on those issues. There are people who are more aware now than they've ever been, I would say. And so, yeah, I think for the normal, or for the, not the normal, what is normal, but for the person who's watching today,
I don't know.
I think the best thing I could say is just educate yourself, because as much as agencies want to claim and some, do a better job than others, but you just really want to make sure you're feeding yourself the right, that you're looking to the right person to get your education, that you're really learning from the voices that you need to be learning from, and not those white-centered voices.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think if we as a society and as a community say, hey, I know there's been a lot of pushback with transracial adoption because a lot of people, especially the Black community and the American Indian and Native and Indigenous communities, have been saying our children need to learn about our culture. And so some of the transracial adoption numbers are like up and down. But I think if we say as a community, like, we have to come together and not look at each other always as a other. But if I choose to open my home, let me learn from you. How can we learn together? I want to celebrate Juneteenth. Everybody should celebrate Juneteenth, right? And I think that if we can come together, some of the misconceptions we have, some of the biases we have, if we can learn together and if we can grow together, then hopefully our systems will kind of begin to change. So in our last few minutes, I definitely want to yield the floor to you. If either one of you have anything else to share with the audience that maybe we missed, or I needed to give you some additional time to say, you all have the floor for the last few minutes.
I'll just go really quickly, Sabrina, and then I'll let you finish us out. But just one thing I wanted to mention, you began this process by doing our land acknowledgement, which I think is a very important practice that I hope that more of us will continue to do. But the Indigenous Child Welfare Act that was passed in the early 70s, which protects tribes and protects children from being unnecessarily removed from Indigenous homes, that is actually, on the table. It's being threatened right now. It's going to the Supreme Court very soon.
Goodness.
And so there's a case called Bracken versus Hayland, I think. But that it's just one, like, if you're listening to this and getting fired up, like, that's maybe something that you can learn about. Call your senator, call your representatives, tell them that we do not need to do away with the Indigenous Child Welfare Act. The Indigenous community in particular, through like boarding schools, thousands and thousands of children were forcibly removed from Indigenous communities and put into these Indian boarding schools, where they were basically stripped of their culture, their language. They were given white names. I mean, I've looked back at some of the pictures of kids going into that with their regalia on. And then when they graduate, they look very European, right? So there's a reason why that act was passed. And so I hope that we can continue with that. And then just the only other point I'll make, we're talking a lot about first families and honoring them and the ways that they have been dealing with all kinds of things when they come into this system, right? And I'm sure that there are probably foster parents out there right now thinking, well, excuse me, like, it's not even safe for my foster child to go, to see their first families. And I just want to validate that. Like, there are cases where safety, of course, in every case should be paramount. But let's say, even if a family, they're just not in the place where they can care for the child in the way that the child needs to grow up into a healthy individual. Once those parental rights are terminated, let's not give up forever. Like, let's be helping our children build their identity, and part of their identity is from their first family, a very important, crucial part of their identity. And so if we are making derogatory comments about first families, children are going to internalize that you're actually, that's where I came from. That's who I'm for. Like, you're making that derogatory comment really about that child. And so I have heard of cases where parental rights were terminated, and the child and, you know, families who ended up adopting the child, they go back and they seek out those first family even 20 years later, you know, and it was a very healing thing for everybody involved. And so even if there are safety concerns and it's not an option to see those first families if parental rights are terminated, let's not say that that has to be forever. The reality is your child is always going to be their child too. Always. That's always going to be where they came from. There's nothing that I can do or you can do that's going to change that. And so and that kind of goes back to the ownership issue that we talked about earlier, but I just wanted to say that.
Yeah. And Cabrina.
Yes, Jenna, kudos. You tie that up in pretty with a pretty little blow of just like all the different things I've seen from start to finish. So initially, you know, we were talking about reunification, and now you brought it all the way to the other side of the spectrum, which is termination of parental rights. And, you know, a lot of us function in that in between, and making sure that, you know, our kids feel loved, making sure they have what they need, making sure they feel secure. All of those things are important. And I feel as though, you know, shared parenting is really like the catalyst for making sure that those things happen. Of course, if it's safe and all the things that have to be there, the shared parenting piece is so important to these kids because, like you said, 9 times out of 10, if they're not in the picture, they're going to seek them out. I'm very sure, you know, there's a very small percentage that's like, look, this is my family. I'm not worried about where I came from. I have this, and this. But the majority of the time, they're going to seek out their bio families. I noticed you call them their first families, but and you know, it's just something that's inevitable. And I feel like if you start from the forefront with the shared parenting and you're inclusive and you know, invite them to things once it's, you know, approved and it's fine, you know, all of those things, your child's going to be thinking of that, of like, you know, they're not going to feel as though you were the person who separated them. You were the person who bridged the gap to keep them together in whatever capacity that may look like, whether it's, you know, fostering, kinship, adoption, whatever, that piece is so vital. And that's the only thing that I really wanted to drive home.
Yeah, and you both have, you know, really brought it to a beautiful place. And I do want to add one more thing. Cabrina, you just said kinship. One of our programs here at the YWCA is the Grandparent Support Network. And so we support grandparents who are caregivers. So they weren't placed in foster families, they weren't adopted, they were placed in kinship care. And what you both said is still reigns true, even when you're in kinship care, that, you know, the children still seek bio parents. They still seek where they came from. They still want to know, you know, what was my mom like? What was my dad like? And so in any placement, you know, and I know, Gina, you said, you know, don't glorify us as the selfless, you know, people, but you know, when you are caring for another child, when you're caring for children, you do have to be selfless, you know, and you have to have hard conversations, even when they are uncomfortable for you. And, you know, that's something I see all the time with the grandparents. Like, you know, we keep the pictures up on the wall, you know, even if mom and dad have passed, like those memories are vital to the children. You know, you could just see them light up, you know, if if the reunification is possible, you know, they get so excited. You know, even if I still get to stay with grandma, I still just want to see my mom. You know, I still want to see my dad, or I still want to see my first family or my bio family. I want to connect with my siblings. And I think, you know, I'll end with the fact that we all need connection. And whether the connection is with our current families, our foster families, our bio families, you know, individuals, all of us as humans, we just need connection, and we need good, strong connection. And so, you know, despite all the racism and systematic racism and the things that we know and don't know, I mean, even as parents, whether you're a bio parent or not, there's lots of stuff that I'm still learning, you know, parenting in general is a learning process. And so, you know, I just ask the audience, like, just maintain good, strong connections. Be wholesome people, be loving to children, whether you know where they come from or you don't, whether they look like you, whether the family makeup, as you see in the grocery store or at church or, you know, shopping looks different. just maintain positive connections. So thank you so much for joining us for Talk on Race, Transracial Adoption, and Foster. This conversation has been a lot. Thank you so much for your time, Gina. Thank you so much for your time, Sabrina. I really appreciate your level of vulnerability and for all of the expertise we brought to the conversation. And please join us next month for Talk on Race, interracial and transracial friendships. So we're going to have friendships and friends coming and talking about how they have navigated life as, as friends across the racial lines.